There was a rising question of what would happen when wartime production slowed and millions of troops returned home. Assistant Secretary of State for Economic Affairs Will Clayton suggested that we would need markets, big markets, in which to buy and sell.
Because the end of the war meant that wartime production would slow, the U.S. hoped to revive the post-war economy by opening trade with Western Europe and with Asia. They also considered trading with the Soviet Union, but soon discarded that idea.
On July 1944, 44 Allied countries met at Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, to discuss the International Monetary Fund, IMF, which maintained stable currencies, and the World Bank, which revived post-war international trade. There was disagreement on how to split land to satisfy all countries economically and politically. There were a lot of questions regarding the future of Germany. The U.S. wanted it as a counterforce to use against the Soviet Union as a strong market for the British and for U.S. goods. The Soviet Union did not want to join the U.S. and Great Britain, which caused them to become loggerheads. U.S. and Great Britain would have used Germany as a bulwark against the Soviet expansion. The Allies worked together to shape the UN, United Nations. 5 members, the US, Great Britain, Soviet Union, France, and China, had absolute veto power over all the other members. These countries formed the Security Council. The UN concentrated on humanitarian programs such as relief agencies. During the Cold War, the west of Europe allied with the US and excluded Communist China. Polarization between the East and the West made it almost impossible for negotiation.
I'm gonna buy a paper doll that I can call my own. A doll that other fellows...
Due to the fact that they could no longer support themselves financially, Great Britain withdrew from the anti-communist government in Greece. Because of this, Truman believed that the Middle East would be taken under the Soviet Union control. He then created the Truman Doctrine, which basically allowed the U.S. to declare the right to intervene to save other countries from communism. Introduced by Secretary of State George C. Marshall, the Marshall Plan was a recovery plan that committed the U.S. to help in the rebuilding of the post-World War II Europe. The plan turned back both socialist and communist bids for power in Northern and Western Europe, and it also introduced American goods and lifestyles. This plan drove a bigger wedge between the U.S. and the Soviet Union. The U.S. wanted to rebuild and integrate western zones of Germany into a unified region compatible with the interests of the U.S. The Soviet Union reacted with the Berlin Blockade, a 300-day blockage of Berlin to the U.S., the British, and the French. In response, 10 European nations, the U.S. and Canada, formed NATO, which was a mutual defense pact. NATO complemented the Marshall Plan, strengthened economic ties by, quote, keeping Russians out, Americans in, and Germans down, end quote. The U.S. monopolized atomic weapons in order to keep the policy of containment, which was keeping communism out of other countries. However, by 1949, the Soviet Union had tested its own atomic bomb. This began the nuclear race between the U.S. and the Soviet Union.
Chestnuts roasting on an open fire.
After World War II, people wanted to live the benefits of wartime saving. However, businesses weren't prospering. They feared another depression and began to blame Truman. Republicans benefited from people's hatred of Truman. However, Truman began to appeal to the people's needs in the election of 1948, and he turned it over and won the election. America could no longer afford its isolationist ideals, so it kicked down the fences of isolation, and then it joined groups like NATO, which were a group of countries that helped protect themselves from foreign threats. And just FYI, That's an eagle that she's drawing, not a turkey. It also helped make organizations like the CIA. America had a growing fear of communist spies, so in order to quench this fear, they passed many acts to test if someone was a spy. However, these acts sometimes accused innocents of being communists. They would lose their jobs, their houses, everything they ever knew, just because of American fear.
They say he wandered very far, very far.
A Democratic representative of Texas told how he believed movie writers were communists. The government began to investigate any movie writers with un-American ideas. But really, they just had foreign ideas. And it was wide accusations like this that brought tension between the American people and the government. With tension so high, many people were being convicted as spies. Sometimes people were wrongly convicted of treason because there was so much fear of the possibility of what a spy could do. The government would not stand for people who spoke out against what they were doing. Politicians began to use McCarthyism as a way to quiet critics. It used smear tactics and innuendo to stop any critics of the Cold War.
The U.S. had a rising feeling of nervousness and anxiousness. It was 50% of the world's wealth, but only 3.6% of its population. Most of its money was earned from wartime production. Now, how would they make money during peace times? There was fear for loneliness, unwantedness, and unemployment. This was portrayed in the media commonly. For example, in The Best 3 Years of Our Lives, 1946. Film noir were stories of ruthless fate and betrayal. They were depressing movies with cynical characters, who were commonly frustrated and angry at life. Many plays and novels were also created, which portrayed characters who were miserable and self-destructive. Many Americans at the time were worried about UFOs. They imagined communist-like invasions, but hoped that the superior creatures would show the world peace. Some people claimed to be contacted by aliens, but the military strongly discouraged it and made the people believe that they didn't really exist. Hollywood, however, supported these ideas and created many movies inspired by alien invasions. The GI Bill was created to aid returning veterans to continue and set up a stable life when they returned. In 1945 to 1960, there was a baby boom generation. This was when soldiers returned home. There were younger marriages, and women's focus usually were directed to raising children and homemaking. However, now 1/3 of all married women worked out of the house. There was a need of more houses, and so not only was there a baby boom, but there was also a construction boom. These new houses were suburban communities, which were more affordable for families. Suburban growth strongly affected cities, making it more poor and racially divided. The Sun Belt also attracted many people. There was warm weather, lower taxes, and had more economic opportunities. There was a high concentration of defense workers in Los Angeles, San Francisco, and Los Alamos. There was an availability of land which was attractive to military planners. There was a high cost for unplanned federally induced growth, urban sprawl, traffic, air pollution, strains on water, energy resources, and environmental degradation.
I would like to notify everybody of the fact that that is supposed to be a nuclear plant. Please excuse our drawing.
During this time, many Americans wanted to revitalize patriotism against Nazis. There was a large public display of rallies, speakers, groups, and students which supported anti-communism. There was a strong involvement of media which supported democracy through magazines and radio. The Freedom Train traveled around from state to state showing patriotic displays. In public education, there was a strong use of propaganda to promote democracy. They even taught their kids that if there was ever a nuclear attack from the Soviet Union, that they should duck under their desk for protection.
The U.S. secured Japan as a stabilizing force in Asia through reconstruction programs that created a constitutional democracy that barred communists and through other reforms. In 1949, the pro-West nationalist government of China collapsed and surrendered to communism. The U.S. blamed the Truman administration for this. Accusations only worsened when the Soviet Union and China joined an alliance together. By the end of World War II, Korea was divided by the Allies. There were hopes to reunite Korea, but the lines between the North and the South merely hardened. The U.S. backed the Democratic South while the Soviet Union backed the Communist North. In 1950, North Korea led a military attack that took over Seoul and pushed deep into South Korea. The U.S. sent troops led by General MacArthur and managed to halt and drive back North Korea to retake South Korea. Basking in victory, Truman wanted to push into North Korea to reunite Korea as a show of democracy. China, who had been silent until now, warned not to cross the border between the North and the South. Chinese troops massed above the UN offensive line and crushed MacArthur's forces, driving him back to South Korea. The NSC-68 reinterpreted both basic policy of containment and decision-making in the government. It encouraged a military approach to the Cold War by raising the military budget, creating H-bombs, and expanding anti-communist propaganda. There were also other massive programs to push back communism. The Korean War costed $100 billion but failed to push back communism much. It established the US versus China and left many Americans skeptical of official policy. Truman's approval rates had dropped 23%, causing him to not run for another term. During the election of 1952, the Korean War became a major issue, with Democrat Adlai Stevenson offering no solution to the Korean or the Cold War in general. Republican Dwight Eisenhower, who promised to end the Korean War, was elected as president.
在你的世界